I'd like to pose all of you a question this evening. It's a question that is quite simple. You might even find it quite funny that I'm putting it to you, but I'll put it anyway. What's the difference between Hong Kong and Haiti, Zurich and Zimbabwe, Perth and Pyongyang? Now that question was put to me a few years ago when I visited my great uncle in Harare in Zimbabwe. I said, what's the difference between Perth and Pyongyang, Zurich and Zimbabwe? I thought, gee, I could come up with 50, 100 reasons. Uncle Mark, I'm sorry, I don't want to offend you and tell you your country's shot. But he said to me, look, there are many differences. If you're going to choose one, it is economic freedom. He said, Paul, that's why you're on the right side of the coin. Unfortunately, I'm on the wrong one. Economic freedom. 6 simple syllables that create a world of difference. It's the freedom to trade, to invest, to purchase, and to own. Now, the relationship between economic freedom and wealth is clear, it's direct, and it's chronicled by history. The history of economic freedom is actually very current at the moment. On Monday, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the speech that propelled Ronald Reagan into the American national conscience. On November the 9th, we'll celebrate 25 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall. So we thought, what better time and what better spirit could we bring to you tonight, the launch of the Fraser Institute's Economic Freedom of the World Index. Now, the big question is, given that we know that there's a direct link between economic freedom and wealth, where will Australia be in tonight's rankings? We know that in the previous index, we fell 5 places, and even more importantly than how well Australia's doing, how well is WA compared to the eastern states? I'm Paul McCarthy, I'm the CEO of Mannkal Economic Education Foundation. Mannkal's a think tank based just around the corner in Subiaco. Our mission is to promote the free market system in Australia. We do a lot of things, but our primary activity is that we run a scholarship program. We send university students to internships around the world and conferences as well. In fact, we've sponsored nearly 700 students to further their studies and kickstart their careers around the globe. Just the other day, we signed off on another 18 to go to Vancouver, LA, Washington DC, New York, Hong Kong, Berlin, Vilnius, which is in Lithuania, Auckland, Sydney, Melbourne, and more. The opportunities are endless. And I'd like, on that note, to acknowledge Becky Vidler, the Mannkal Scholarship Coordinator in the front row here, who does a fantastic effort. Now, I'd like to urge all the students here tonight, when you go home at the end of this evening, log on to our website at mannkal.org and check out the great opportunities on offer. And to those of you who are past university age, we're looking for some ambassadors to help promote our program. We have a great complement of ambassadors so far. We're looking for people who help us sponsor these fantastic interns to further themselves around the world. Now, I'd like to acknowledge tonight our sponsors. The Institute of Public Affairs, John Roscombe at the back, visiting from Melbourne, welcome. The Chamber of Commerce and Industry of WA, Packer & Co, Cunning's Purple, AMEC, the Association of Mining and Exploration Companies, and Business News WA. We appreciate your support very, very much. Now, I welcome our international guest tonight, and first I should also welcome a very special guest, the Treasurer of Western Australia, the Honourable Dr. Mike Nahan, MLA, at the back of the room there. I'd like to welcome our international guest, Mr. Fred McMahon from the Fraser Institute. He'll shortly present the Freedom Index to us. However, the first speaker tonight is a magnificent young man. He's a Mannkal scholar, and we're really proud to call him a Mannkal scholar, Tiago Brunei. Tiago's a Curtin University student. He recently undertook an internship in Vancouver with the Fraser Institute, and he's here to say a few words about his experience. Welcome, Tiago.
Thanks, Paul, for introducing me. First, I'd like to thank Mannkal for inviting me to speak tonight. It's an absolute honor for having the opportunity to share my experiences with you. Good evening. My name is Tiago Brunei, and I'm one of Mannkal's alumni. Last summer, I had the privilege of attending a short internship at the Fraser Institute in the headquarters in Vancouver, Canada. A great experience that would not have been possible without the general support that I received from Mannkal. My time at the Fraser Institute was wonderful in every sense of the word. From day one, I received professional guidance and challenging work and research tasks. My areas of work and research range from mining regulations around the globe to the relationship of Canadian Aboriginal First Nations with the mining industry in northern Canada. While I would love to share with you some more details of the work I've done, I'm still bound by a confidentiality agreement assigned on my first day, so there's very little else I can say at this point without being sued. Although I did not have the opportunity of being involved with the making of this year's World Economic Freedom Index, I am honored of having the chance of working with the world-class professionals that compiled such an important piece of research. For the world today is going through increasingly volatile times. The European Union is once again on the brink of an economic recession, and numerous governments around the world are leaning towards failed economic ideologies, becoming progressively more interventionist and assertive over the financial decisions of private citizens and businesses alike. Policies that will gradually hinder economic development, as well as our ability to shape our own financial futures. Let us remember that those that at this very moment are willing to risk their lives for the sake of tasting freedom for one day, or simply for the right of choosing their own leaders, something that most of us take for granted today. And let us not forget that although we are in the 21st century, we have recently witnessed several nations falling back to the violence, intolerance, and instability that the medieval ages are best known for. That is why I believe this index is much more than a number, and that's why I believe that anyone that upholds freedom and liberty, be it an important think tank or a lonely student fighting on the streets, deserves to know there are several others out there who support the cause. For history has taught us that freedom and liberty do not come from governments. They come from me, they come from you, they come from all of us, the subjects of government. Thank you. I'd like now to introduce Makuka Kasande, a Murdoch University student who is here to talk about the economic freedom in her home country of Zambia. Makuka, please.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Makuka, and I'm an economics honors student at Murdoch University. I'm here to share a little bit about my country, Zambia, which is the topic of my thesis. So for those of you who are wondering, Zambia is a country in southern Africa. And if you put your finger at the very north tip of Australia, run it across into the African continent, when you hit the middle, that's where Zambia is. So if you hit Zimbabwe, you've gone too far down. And if you hit Congo, you've gone a little bit too far up. So we have a population of just over 14 million, and our main industries include copper mining, a largely subsistent agriculture sector, and a rapidly developing services sector. I think we can all agree that leadership has a significant impact on the direction that a country takes. So I thought to look at Zambia's economic history through the terms of our national leadership. 50 years ago, Northern Rhodesia, which was a British colony, officially became Zambia. Under the leadership of President Kenneth Kaunda, the government embarked on a program of nationalization. This was meant to diversify and grow the economy, to shield the nation from regional politics, and also detached from our colonial history. So some have described this period as a socialist period, and by the late 1980s, the system proved unsustainable. After almost 3 decades, it was time for a change. So in 1991, President Frederick Chiloba came into power, and his government began the liberalization process. He strongly believed that government has no business doing business. And so, the process involved privatization, lifting of trade restrictions, and encouraging private investors, both local and international. During this time, unemployment levels rose, and the country experienced the sharpest fall in GDP and productivity growth since independence. However, towards the end of the 1990s, the positive effects began to show. Unfortunately, so did corruption. In 2001, President Levy Mwanawasa came into power, and he was determined to continue the growth agenda and eradicate corruption in all government institutions. Unfortunately, he passed away during his second term of office and was succeeded by Rupiah Banda, who aimed to continue to drive the nation forward. By this time, GDP growth was positive, and for the period between 2002 and 2011 had averaged close to 6%. The 2011 elections ushered in President Mannkal, who passed away yesterday. May his soul rest in peace. And Zambia is still on the path of private sector-led development. There has been a resurgence of investment in infrastructure, mining, agriculture, and tourism. This year, Zambia ranks 9th out of 46 countries in sub-Saharan Africa in the index, with improvements in government spending, business, trade, investment, and monetary freedom. So having celebrated 50 years of independence just last week, it's been interesting for me to look at Zambia's economic history and what role liberalization has played in our journey. The transition to a more market-oriented economy may be quick and seem easy, but realizing the benefits are slow. There must be consistent efforts by successive governments to preserve these benefits. And so I look forward to the next 50 years of Zambia's economic growth and the contributions that I'll be able to make to the development of my place of birth. Thank you.
Thank you, Tiago Makuka. Makuka told me earlier that the Zambia-Zimbabwe rivalry is sort of like a WA Eastern States rivalry, and she asked me if I could put in a few more insults at Zimbabwe next time. Now, for the main event of the evening, the presentation of the Economic Freedom of the World Index by Fred McMahon of the Fraser Institute. The Fraser Institute is an independent Canadian public policy, research and education organisation. They have active research ties with other organisations in more than 80 countries around the world, which is remarkable. They're often referred to as a think tank and have been rated by the University of Pennsylvania as the top think tank in Canada. So we're very honoured to have you here and happy that you took up our invitation to visit. Fred's going to tell us about what the index is, how it's formulated, and he's going to tell us what we're waiting to hear, how well Australia did. And hopefully we beat the Eastern States. Ladies and gentlemen, Fred McMahon.
Well, thank you so much. It's a great honor to be here. It's also a great challenge. I'm used to speaking to audiences with a cup of coffee in front of them, not audiences with a glass of wine in their hands. So this is going to be an interesting experiment. The first thing I want to say is what remarkable presentations from those Mannkal scholars. So quickly and profoundly and concisely capturing the idea of economic freedom. And yes, Zambia is a country that we look at quite closely. It moved to free markets, then it had a bit of a retreat, and now it seems to be moving back. It, like Botswana before it, and Botswana's gone down a bit, but it, like Botswana before it, could be a real hope for the whole continent and the world. Immense potential there. I want to start by thanking Ron Manners, who made all of this possible. You already had a sense of the spectacular work that Mannkal does and the huge benefit it brings not just to its scholars, but to Australia for those who come back here, and internationally for those who will go to their home countries. It is really a profound advance and light. I'd also like to thank Paul McCarthy for he's the new CEO and he's doing a spectacular job. Genevieve Mitchell, Becky Vidler, and John Roscombe too. I really appreciate all their support. So I'm here today to talk to you about economic freedom. I only hope that I can be half as elegant as the students who preceded me. What is economic freedom? Well, I won't bore you with the detailed explanations. The whole project started in the mid-1980s. In fact, in 1984, Milton Friedman had always claimed that economic freedom created better lives for people. And Mike Walker, then head of the Fraser Institute, in effect said, Milton, prove it. Because no one had actually defined what economic freedom was, and certainly no one had measured what economic freedom was. That led to a 10-year research project that involved 60 of the world's top scholars, including 3 Nobel laureates, to define exactly what economic freedom was and how to measure it. So I'm not going to go through that 10 years of research, because I think people probably want to get back to their glasses of wine. But economic freedom is simply the ability of individuals and families to make their own economic decisions. As Paul said earlier, the evidence is in. Economically free societies produce much more prosperity than non-economically free societies. It's simply true that the drive and ingenuity of individuals beat government planning or greedy elites hands down every day of the week. And impediments to economic, impediments that stop people who are willing to make voluntary transactions, simply reduce the dynamics of individual drive and ingenuity. And this aspect of prosperity is what's really important in Australia. But let me explain why economic freedom is so much more important and so much broader on a global scale. Democracy, true democracy, liberal democracy, is impossible without economic freedom. If you're beholden to a greedy elite or government for your job, for your ability to feed and clothe your family, to get even a promotion, to move about, then it becomes extremely difficult for you to express your political opinion, because you're always at somebody else's mercy. And therefore it becomes extremely difficult to promote democracy until anger spills over as it did in the Arab world. But even more importantly than that, economic freedom changes the dynamics of a society. Without economic freedom, gaining power is not like it is in Australia or Canada or the United States, where you debate policy and determine your direction forward. Winning power is about winning the spoils of the game. You and your cronies exclude others for your advantage. This is usually based on sectarian lines, as you see in the Arab world right now, or ethnic divides, or tribal divides. This sets group against group, because the winners take all. It's not that they set policy. They control the wealth of the country. And they exclude those from other groups from sharing in the wealth of the country. This sets group against group. Not only that, the dynamic is you gain by making somebody worse off. Economic freedom changes all of that, because you can only get ahead in an economically free society if you make goods and services others voluntarily want to purchase. In other words, you only get ahead by making other people better off. That changes the basis of society. But it does something even more than that. In a non-economically free society, you try to exclude those from other groups, whether ethnic or religious or tribal. With economic freedom, people in other groups become your customers, your suppliers, your fellow business people. In other words, you have these lines cutting across sectarian and religious and tribal divides The miracle doesn't happen overnight, but when you look around the world, it's the economically free societies that have the highest level of tolerance and the highest levels of democracy. And that's because economic freedom is not just an economic thing. It's a thing that affects the whole nature and dynamics of society. Now, this chart looks at the quarter most free nations here and the least free nations. This is something that I think we all now accept. It's something that Paul said, that economically free societies produce far more prosperity. So the per capita income in the most economically free societies is around $40,000. In the least free societies, it's around $6,000. And it's even worse in many countries we can't measure. Cuba's not in the index. North Korea's not in the index because we can't get reliable data. But the relationship to prosperity is undoubted. Now, I should mention these quartile charts are simply snapshots in time. They don't prove causation, they simply prove correlation. But these quartile charts are carefully selected. They reflect much more sophisticated research than simply quartile charts. So in the 500 peer-reviewed academic articles and policy articles that have been based on the Economic Freedom Index, these results have been proven in much more rigorous form. Now, a lot of people say, oh yeah, economic freedom is fine, but it's the rich who take everything home. It doesn't benefit the poor. Well, that's the average per capita income of the poorest 10% in the least free societies, about $11,000 a year, versus the per capita income of the poorest 10% in the least free societies, which is less than 1/10 of what it is in the most free societies. You know, I'd much rather be poor in Canada than be poor in Zimbabwe. This reflects the dynamics I discussed earlier about economic freedom and other freedoms, and the dynamics of the society and acceptance. This chart makes me feel very sad for our friends on the left. Our friends on the left argued for years. Well, first they argued that a planned economy produced much greater prosperity than a free market economy. Well, they finally gave up on that, so they said, no, it's not prosperity that matters, it's happiness that matters. And we'll all be happy and jolly under left-wing government, so it doesn't matter if we're a little bit poorer. Well, they've actually started to do some research on that. And what they've discovered is even when you hold income constant, to use an econometric term, people in economically free societies are happier than people in non-economically free societies. Even if you take two countries that have the same income, one is economically free and its income is doubtless increasing. One is non-economically free and its income is stagnant. So they're going to pass like ships in the night. But even if you hold income constant, the research shows, by sociologists of all people, who aren't great friends of free markets in general, that people in economically free societies are happier. Now, this sort of research doesn't show, it shows that causation flows from economic freedom to happiness. It doesn't show why causation flows. Their best guess is, and I think it's a good one, is that people who feel like they're in charge of their own economic fate are happier because they control their lives. This is an important chart. Not only is literacy higher in economically free societies, but the gap between girls and boys, men and women, closes up as the society gets more economically free. And as much research has shown, one of the single most, not one of, the single most important things in making a society work better, other than economic freedom, is the education of girls and women. And because people are treated as individuals rather than as part of a group, because people have their own potential that they can maximize in an economically free society, education improves, and the gap between boys and girls, men and women improves. So Paul told you that we'd look at the race, and actually I've done something a little bit different today. I'm not simply going to look at Australia. What I did was I took because Australia ranks, I think it is 8th in the world, but different states have different policies. So you would think that not every state in Australia would rank the same. Some have more regulations, some have more spending, some have bigger governments. So there's a range of how the states would actually rank if they were independent in the world index. So what I did was I took the IPA ranking of 2014 data on states and applied that to the world index. Now, if we have another glass of wine and anybody wants to talk to me for about 3 hours, I'll describe how I did this. Raise your hands. Okay. But this is the result. So Western Australia would actually be 3rd in the world. And you notice who's number 24th? By the way, what we find when we introduce the economic freedom of the world thing is some people from some countries go, "How can my country be that high? Don't you realize how bad we are?" Whereas others go, "How can my country be that low? Don't you know how good we are?" Well, Canada for years ranked in the top 10, even though we had leftish governments. We used to say the same thing, how can Canada be that high? It turns out our left-wing governments didn't do much damage to Canada. In fact, we had our biggest move towards economic freedom under a supposedly left-wing government. These things get mixed up and shaped. Anyways, this should be treated as approximate, but clearly Western Australia has done very well. But that's no reason for complacency or backsliding, because there are very, very serious threats coming down the road. There are flawed policies in place, which I'll talk about a little bit. New and difficult challenges are rising. Resources won't be the solution. The resource wealth that Western Australia has experienced can paper over a lot of sins. So the government doesn't have to raise taxes sky high because it gets the flow of resource revenues. So you appear economically freer than you would be in the long term if the resource revenues dry out. And good, renewed policy is needed. Now, Western Australia, unlike many resource-rich nations, because of its high level of economic freedom, has done very well in the past. Your challenge is to do very well in the future. Now let's talk about resources, because there's been a big debate, and I've been warning for years, that the resources aren't going to remain that high. Well, just take a look at this. And it actually looks like there's been a long-term change, like resources have bounced up to a new level. And they may come down a bit, but it looks like they're at a new level. Well, that's good until you look at the real long term. And there you see there has been a long-term decline in resources. And that big bump on the other chart doesn't look so big or unusual on this chart. And after resources bumped up here, they just resumed their flow down. There are several reasons for that. One is, of course, the way a market economy works. Resources get very expensive, and people go out and find more resources. Resources get very expensive, and people who've been buying the raw materials go out and find other ways to do things. There's also recycling more and more. And, of course, the reason that people thought that this boom was going to last forever was because of China. Well, that's not going to work out at all. Everyone's now talking about weakness in China. But there's something else and something deeper going on there. China is changing its economic phase. It has just gone through an economic phase where you build factories and roads and things that require a lot of resources. China is now moving into a high-tech economy. You know, there's a big difference in weight between an iPhone and a bridge. And they're going to start producing more iPhones and gadgets than they are bridges. They're moving into the service economy. So even if China wasn't facing its current economic weakness, that huge source of demand, which people thought would last forever, was about to fade out anyway. And there are a lot of imbalances in the Chinese economy right now that means that that could be combined with an actual economic crisis. So Western Australia, if it's going to continue on its prosperity, has to move away from perverse policies and pick up its game. Okay, so the challenges that Western Australia faces are, as I've mentioned, uncertainty over commodity prices. You can't buy your way out of bad policy anymore. Uncertainty about global growth, particularly China. And I'm quoting here from the Australian, China is at risk of a financial collapse that would turn Australia's budget deficit into, quote, a fiscal disaster, a fiscal fiasco. So that's another challenge facing Western Australia. And I spoke about backsliding and complacency. So what in the good times that really don't show up are the problems that may hit you if the bad times come, and the reason why you have to pick up your game. There are incredible barriers to the labor market in Western Australia and Australia on the whole. When you're really wealthy, they actually don't create that many impediments to economic freedom, because everybody's getting paid well and everybody can afford to be paid well. But in a downturn where you don't have that much money and not everybody can afford to pay or be paid well, they start blocking voluntary contracts between willing employees and willing employers in the labor market. That can cause skyrocketing unemployment. And what is sort of a faded barrier now can become a true barrier to employment and a true generator of unemployment. Deficits and poorly directed spending. It's easy to spend a lot when you have a lot of money. But just as the Australian said, and there are many more reasons than the Australian noted, if spending is poorly directed in a downturn, you face a real crisis. My understanding is that the tax system is far too complicated here. I was shocked to hear that Western Australia has energy subsidies. My goodness, that's places like Egypt that have energy subsidies, not advanced countries who know how economies work. Employment. You may be moving from the mining to the petrochemical area, but petrochemicals do not produce anything like the volume and number of employment that the mining industry does. So that's not a salvation. And you may be facing a housing boom collapse because of this. So the bottom message, the end-all message is Western Australia has done really well. It has one of the best records in the world. While those rankings were only approximate, it is approximately around third best in the world. That is pretty good. But of course you're competing with two jurisdictions that have no natural resources at all, Singapore and Hong Kong. So if your natural resources wealth begins to peter out as a crutch, you may be left vulnerable. Western Australia has done very well. It's why you've turned resource wealth into broad-scale prosperity. But now the challenge you face is complacency and backsliding and leaving in place impediments to the market that didn't much matter when a lot of money was coming in, but are going to start cutting soon. And I want to recommend a marvelous study that really shows the way forward for Western Australia, and that's Mannkal's Project Australia. And I have the download address here, so everyone can, take a note on what it is right now. But so that's the bottom line message. You've done very well, but you have to keep your game up, or problems may arise. Thank you so much for your attention, and thanks the students for marvelous presentations.
There's a three-word answer why South Australia beats Queensland, according to the IPA Index of Economic Freedom in Australia. And that three-word answer is the Bligh government. That was the regulations and the laws that the Bligh government and the Labor governments passed that was so much worse than anything in many other states. My name is John Roscombe, and I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of Public Affairs, and it is wonderful to be with you tonight and to have had a great presentation from Fred, and we're absolutely honoured to have you here tonight. The importance of your message, Fred, is signified by the range of people we have here tonight. IPA members and supporters, Mannkal supporters, people like Tim Andrews from the Australian Taxpayers Alliance, Deidre Wilmot from the CCI, my predecessors at the IPA, John Hyde, and we had earlier tonight here what I think is, or who I think is Australia's best treasurer, Mike Nahan, and of course Hal Clough as the director of the IPA. This couldn't be have taken place without the support of Ron Manners and Mannkal and Paul. The message that you gave tonight is exactly the message that Mannkal is sending when it sends its scholars around the world. The morality of freedom, the morality of capitalism. And this wonderful book, edited by Tom Palmer, is available in the back of the room, The Morality of Capitalism. And what's so exciting about Fred's work and about the work of the Fraser Institute is that it connects economics to our basic civil liberties, to our basic human rights. And I think all of us who believe in freedom have for too long said economic rights are over there, property rights are over there, the right to seek a job is over there, and our right to freedom of speech, our right to remain silent if we're questioned by the government after being accused of an offence, our right to a fair trial is over here. And I think what's exciting, and the point that Fred makes, is they are completely connected. So as much as we have to talk about the right to freedom of speech in Australia and the repeal of Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act, we also have to talk about why does Australia have amongst the highest marginal tax rates in the world. So they are absolutely intimately connected, and it's a very powerful message of Fred, and it is the message that Mannkal is taking forward. So from the IPA's work, we are looking at the national curriculum, and we see how young people are told in history textbooks used in Queensland and New South Wales, where students are learning about the Russian Revolution and Russian history, that for most people living in Russia under Stalin, their lives improved. Great. That's what people are being told. We are being told that the life of people in the Stone Age was better than the life we have now. The most important thing Fred said was about winners and losers, and this is what we are seeing young people being told. They are being told that in the capitalist system you gain by making someone else worse off. Fred's point is capitalism, freedom, free markets are win-win situations, and I think that is the huge importance of the message that Fred spoke to us about tonight. And as a Victorian, I am not surprised that Western Australia ranks so high, and I think the challenge for all of us is, in the coming debate about federalism, is to not drag Western Australia down to Victoria's level or Queensland's level, but drag all of us up to West Australians' level. So we now have some time for some questions to Fred, and then Ron will wind up the evening. So Fred, do you want to join us?
Sure. Can I bring my glass?
You can bring your glass.
I'm free.
There and then there.
Hi, my name's Angus. I'm a Mannkal scholar and I'm at Fraser Institute. My question to you, and it sort of touches on some of the comments that have been made, is with regards to Hong Kong and Singapore being ranked number one. And although there's been comments made tonight about relationships between economic freedom and political freedom, what's interesting is that Hong Kong and Singapore are by no means politically free. So I'd just like you to provide some commentary on the relationship there, because those two examples appear to go against this general connection. So if you can just comment on that, thank you.
And that's a very good point. Now, anybody who does statistics knows that there are outriders. And Hong Kong and Singapore are outriders. There are a couple other, frankly, outriders. When you do the statistical study, the relationship is extraordinarily strong. I used to have the great pleasure of talking to audiences of anti-globalist students at university. And I would say to them, well, everyone knows that free markets are anti-democratic, and you can't have a democratic society where there are free markets. They'd all nod, they'd say, well, that's what we expected from the Fraser Institute. And then I'd say, okay, can anyone here name a single country that has a stable, liberal democracy that is not economically free, that does not have a free market? So yes, Hong Kong and Singapore are outriders. They are exceptions. Now, Hong Kong, had it remained on its own, as we can see from what's going on now in Hong Kong, would have become a democracy. And without the thumb of China over, it would be a democracy. So we have one big outrider there, and that's the city-state of Singapore. So yeah, there are outriders. The relationship holds in general for the reasons that I and John mentioned. But yeah, there are outriders.
Thanks for the talk. My name's Charles. It's almost a follow-up to Angus's question. I was going to say that I think we all as Western Australians appreciate that you split Australia up into separate jurisdictions to sort of show us where we sat. I was wondering if you undertook the same study for any other major federal countries, so maybe the US or Canada or even China in a sense. And I was wondering whether there were any outlier states from any of those jurisdictions.
I launched, and I'm one of the authors of not now the principal author, of the economic freedom of North America. I just don't have the time to do the detailed work anymore. So we look at the economic freedom of Canada, the United States, and this year I'm proud to say we've incorporated Mexico into the index. Now, we've had a Mexican measure before, but because data was lacking and inconsistent, we weren't able to incorporate it into the full thing. This year, because of an amazing young economist there, Jose Torra, we've been able to do it. Now, I haven't done with Canada, the United States, and Mexico what I did here for Australia, and that is use the provincial figures to break out how it would do on the chart. But frankly, Canada goes from very high levels of economic freedom in Alberta and Saskatchewan to very low levels of economic freedom in my home province of Nova Scotia. In fact, I wrote an award-winning book, won an international award, surprisingly, that was called Looking the Gift Horse in the Mouth. And it was all about Atlantic Canada and the huge amounts of money we received from the rest of Canada, and saying it basically suppressed space for free exchange. So I think you'd see a much greater diffusion. I think you'd probably see Quebec and Saskatchewan and Alberta, probably roughly the same place that Western Australia is, but Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and some other places well below Queensland.
Tasmania.
Tasmania.
Yeah, and then there.
Just to follow up to the first question, how do you know that the economic freedom is a consequence of political freedom, not the other way around? I think you sort of hinted at that, but you didn't quite say how you know that. And perhaps that would explain that Hong Kong is not.
I don't know how many people here have heard of Granger causality, but it's a way of testing causal relationships. And what the studies show is that economic freedom causes other freedoms in democracy, and other freedoms in democracy cause economic freedom. In other words, it seems to work both ways. They reinforce each other by the most sophisticated techniques.
Hi, Doug Hall. I'm an industry development specialist. Thanks for your presentation. I've worked with a range of industries like water, waste, and training. And in Australia, at least, these are industries that are still very heavily involved with government and over-regulated. And I just wondered in your analysis whether you've looked at sub-industries. So obviously Australia is very free in mining, but the potential, I think, in this area of human services, for example, the Hillmore report in 1993 hardly mentioned the Productivity Commission in 2005 said this is an area where there needs to be more work. The current competition policy has again highlighted the need for work in this area. So have you looked at that industry differences, and if you have, how are other countries addressing these human services areas and opening them up to true competition?
Unfortunately, we don't. We only use third-party data, so our subjective judgments don't go into it. And there is not good data on that sort of not good internationally comparative data on that sort of level. So you can get data for one country and a data for another, but they aren't necessarily consistent, so you can't make the measures. We do know the index works because it shows up very powerfully when you do statistical testing. So it's capturing it, and some of these things will serve as proxies for what you're talking about. We'd love to do it, it's just the data's not there.
Last three. 1, 2.
Over time, how has Australia gone, and are there any countries where there's been an improvement in or can you use this index for temporal comparisons?
Australia, more or less like Canada, perhaps because of our background, has typically bounced around in the top 10. I left my book downstairs, and I wish I could open it now to see how you were doing under Whitlam. Am I pronouncing his name correctly?
Rest in peace.
Rest in peace, yes. And, the Labour governments. But typically, Australia's been good. There are a couple countries that have moved dramatically. One of them is New Zealand, as you would expect. It moved from a very low level to a much higher level, and its prosperity took off. An even better example is Ireland, which really did magnificent economic reforms. Now, I know people are going to say, well, Ireland suffered from the financial crisis, and people will try to associate the financial crisis with economic freedom. But let me assure you, Greece was not an economically free country. Spain was not an economically free country. So it hit just about everyone. But Ireland's been an amazing success story. The United States has declined significantly in economic freedom. And it's not for the reason that you might think bigger and bigger government. In fact, it still does fairly well in government. It's the buildup of regulations and a deterioration in the rule of law, and that has both economic and non-economic causes. The non-economic causes are the war on terrorism, which has deteriorated the rule of law. Now, I'm not going to enter a debate here. Some people will say, well, the trade-off is worth it, and some people will say it isn't, but it still causes a deterioration in the rule of law. And all the quasi-judicial things in Sarbanes-Oxley and so on. So the United States is a country that has declined.
Oh, yep.
I'm just for this event, so it's good, it's work. Thanks for that. Two questions, one serious, one not. Doesn't fit in here, come from Mummy for this. That's nothing quite, we get subsidies anyway, so yeah. One is, I know you may not know all Australia's economic laws, this was goes to the IPO. But what would be some appropriate low-hanging legal fruit to make Western Australia more economically competitive in the global market? And the second question is, Western Australia secession, pick a date.
Now, which was the serious question? Look, I'm not an expert enough on Western Australia. The big thing that I've heard about are the labor laws, the negotiating thing, and so on. And what I don't know is whether that's federal or state level. But that's the first thing I would tackle, and that can have absolutely horrible consequences if there is any significant downturn in excluding people, particularly the most vulnerable, from the labor market. On your second question, Canada, yeah, of course, has lots of experience with secessionist movements. So bring in Parti Québécois. You know, in Quebec, speaking about free speech, when you put up a sign, they've liberalized it. You're now allowed to use English words, but they have to be smaller than the French words. So you actually get people from what's called the language police going around with tape measures, measuring the size of English versus French words.
I was there 2 years ago, I was quite surprised.
Yeah.
Highway travel, some of these French signs, you have no idea what you're doing, which is okay, because here I don't know what I'm doing anyway.
I might just very quickly, great question. From an IPA perspective, let's assume, for the sake of your question, that we won't give Western Australia its own currency yet, but I think we should. But then you'd have to assume that fiat money will continue to exist. Leaving aside that thought experiment, sorry? Absolutely, and should be able to pay your taxes and fines in Bitcoin in Western Australia. On a serious note, Western Australia needs to keep and strengthen its own industrial relations system. It should pull out of the national curriculum. It should also have its own income taxing powers, as is now on the agenda. And talking about states, We're only a few years away from actually not laughing about succession. There's a new paper out by the Committee for Economic Development of Australia that was published a couple of days ago, actually, in the wake of Tony Abbott's announcements on federalism. And there's a really interesting discussion about states. Geoffrey Blaney made this point in the 50s, and now you have people like A.J. Brown and Nicholas Aroney making this point. Federalism has to adapt, and we continue to think of federalism as just a financial thing. Nearly every other federal system in the world has actually had new states and different shaping territories. From an IPA perspective, there's no reason why Far North Queensland can't be a state, why there can't be separate states in Western Australia. There's another thing you shouldn't do. You shouldn't forcibly amalgamate local councils. All the evidence, and this is touched upon in the CEDA report, all the evidence from Victoria, from New South Wales, from overseas, is that the larger the local council, the greater the taxing powers of that council, and the greater government grows. And I think we spend too much time talking about federal government and the evils of federal government. We have to understand local councils are just as much government. They have just as much regulatory authority, if not more than federal and state governments. In Melbourne, we've had a huge issue about a fellow in the inner city Melbourne who wanted to paint his fence pink. And he did. Pink and green and red. And it was a front page story. The council said, you can't paint your fence. That's local council. So they're just a couple of things off the top of my head. But Western Australia has to stay a bastion of freedom to guide Victoria and the rest of Australia. Eleanor.
By the way, just to add to that, there's a funny story from my hometown that's almost the reverse of what you had. There were some old wooden houses that the guy wanted to tear down and put up as an apartment house, and they were not historical, but the regulators and the whatever said no, they're historical, you can't tear them down. But we didn't have any regulations about painting them, so we painted them bizarre colors, green and red and purple, with strange little patterns on them. And finally, the regulatory folks said, "Okay, tear them down." But what I want to know is what you're going to call your currency, the Wessie. Canadians call our dollar the loonie. And you may think that's a sign of disrespect. What is actually the reason for the name of the dollar, the loonie, is the government-run post office in Canada. They sent the dies for the original new coins, dollar coins, to the mint through the post office, and they had something like polar bears on them, and the post office lost them. So they had to come up with a new design, and the new design had a loon on it, and that's why Canadians call our dollar the loonie, because of the post office.
Eleanor, final question.
I was actually just going to ask about the index itself, and if you'll just list off, I've used the index in some magazines that I've produced, but if you'll just share what the categories in the index are, because I didn't mention that.
I wanted to go quickly, and I'll go quickly now.
Yeah.
We have 42 separate variables from all third-party sources. We group those 42 separate variables into 5 areas. Size of government. If government is too big, taxes too much, and then it's violating your property rights, taking too much of your property, and limiting the space for free exchange. Perhaps the single most important one, not for a place like Australia or Canada, but for the developing world, is the rule of law and property rights. The rule of law and property rights are the infrastructure of economic freedom. If the poor and the dispossessed are not protected by the rule of law, and their property is not protected by the rule of law, they will be taken advantage of by the rich and powerful. Up until about a decade ago, this was an area, or maybe 2 decades ago, this was an area people on our side of the street didn't pay enough attention to. We looked at our problems, which were over big government, over regulation, and so on, and we went to third world countries and said, okay, you got to cut the size of government and regulation, which is quite right. But we didn't focus on the rule of law because we just took it as wallpaper. Sound money, which is largely a solved problem, at least in about 90% of the world's nations. Government can expropriate your property through inflation every bit as easily as it can through taxation. Freedom to trade internationally. Everyone here should be able to buy and sell from anybody in Western Australia, from anybody in Australia, and from anybody in the rest of the world. And regulation. Regulation of credit, labor, and business. You should be able to borrow from whom you wish, or invest in, or lend to whom you wish. In the Arab world, because of their Sharia law, I have to say, invest in whom you wish, take investments from whom you wish, so they get around that no interest thing. Labor, you should be able to hire whom you wish, you should be able to fire whom you wish, and you should be able to voluntarily reach agreement on the amount paid, and the hours worked, and that's a problem here in Australia, a very big problem in my view. And business, you should be able to open a business when you wish and close it when you wish. You know, in lots of parts of the world, people are afraid to open a business because if they do and they're successful and they get registered, they can't close it. They have to keep losing money. It's very bizarre. So those are the 5 areas: regulation, size of government, rule of law, sound money, international trade.
Thank you, Fred. Can I ask you to welcome the great Ron Manners?
Fred, thank you for coming all this way to reinforce our beliefs in free markets as a solution to almost all of mankind's problems. Sometimes we have these little moments of doubt where there's a bit of a glitch here and there, but we're reinforced. Thank you so much. Now also, there's a couple of things we want you to take with you, but this one you probably should drink tonight. This one, it's a little bit of Margaret River wine, so that's yours. But now I'll just get you to step forward and take this one. This actually may save your life. Your study tonight was very scientific, and we've done a little bit of a scientific study here. This is a crocodile tooth on a pendant that you can hang around your neck, and I'll put it around your neck too, because evidence has shown that no Canadian wearing one of these in Australia has ever been eaten by a crocodile.
Thank you. Ron's right, I have to drink it tonight because I only carry travel on, so anyone who wants to join me,
On the footpath, Now, this is a wonderful opportunity to wish Paul well. Paul's our new CEO at Mannkal, an outstanding guy, and he's been awarded an Atlas Research Institute, it's called the Think Tank MBA course, that he's flying out tonight to attend this in Washington and then moving on to New York. So Paul, all the best. You're pretty damn good now, but you're going to be really dangerous when you go. Anyone wants to keep drinking? I think if there's nothing happening downstairs, you go around to the, is that right? The Richardson Hotel in Richardson Street? Richardson.
Yeah.
Okay. They're around in Richardson Street, so that's where we can continue the discussion. Thank you, folks, and thank you, John, for coming over and joining us tonight.